You know, after 40 years on this bench, I thought I had seen everything. But one Tuesday morning in March, an elderly man shuffled into my courtroom who would break my heart and restore my faith in humanity all at the same time. What happened that day, what I witnessed about compassion and the cruelty of a system that sometimes forgets we're dealing with human beings, it still brings tears to my eyes. And what I decided to do, the verdict I delivered, it reminded me exactly why I became a judge in the first place. Let me tell you exactly what happened that day, because this is a story about dignity, memory, and what justice really means when we remember that mercy is just as important as the law. But before I tell you this whole story, do me a favor. Hit that subscribe button and drop a comment telling me where you're watching from, because what I'm about to share with you is something that needs to be heard. Trust me, you won't want to miss a single word of this. I've been a judge in Providence, Rhode Island for 40 years now. Every morning I wake up at 6:30. I have my coffee strong and black, 2 pieces of toast with butter, and I read the Providence Journal while my wife Joyce makes sure I remember to take my vitamins. She's been doing that for 48 years of marriage, and I still forget half the time. I get to the courthouse at 8:15, same time every day since 1984. My clerk, Christina, meets me at my chambers with another cup of coffee and the day's docket. She knows me better than I know myself sometimes. My father came to this country from Italy with nothing but a suitcase and a dream. He couldn't speak English. He worked 3 jobs to feed our family. He taught me something that I've carried with me every single day of my life. He said, "Franco, treat everyone with respect. The man who sweeps the street has the same dignity as the man who owns the building." That lesson, those words, they've guided every decision I've made from this bench. I learned early in my career that being a judge isn't about hammering people with the law. It's about understanding the human being standing in front of you. It's about seeing their struggles, their circumstances, their story. Because behind every citation, every violation, every mistake, there's a person, there's a life, there's usually a reason, and my job is to balance justice with compassion, to uphold the law while remembering that mercy is what makes us human. That particular morning, that Tuesday in March, I remember feeling good. It was one of those early spring days where you can smell the change in the air. Winter was finally letting go. The sun was coming through my chamber windows in a way that made me think about renewal, about fresh starts. I had no idea that I was about to meet someone who needed a fresh start more than anyone I'd seen in years. I went through my morning routine. I put on my robes. I straightened my tie underneath. I looked at the photographs on my desk, my grandchildren, my wife, my parents. I said a little prayer like I do every morning. I asked for wisdom, for patience, for the ability to see clearly and judge fairly. Then I walked into my courtroom. The gallery was already filling up. I could see people checking their phones, looking nervous, whispering to each other. Some were dressed in suits, clearly taking this seriously. Others were in work uniforms, having taken time off from their jobs to be here. I saw a young mother with a baby, an older gentleman in a veteran's cap, a woman who looked like she'd been crying. Each one of them had a story. Each one of them needed something from me that day. Christina handed me the docket. I scanned through it quickly, parking violations mostly. A few moving violations. Nothing unusual. Nothing that stood out. It looked like a typical Tuesday morning in traffic court. I had no idea that case number 7 on my list would be the one I'd remember for the rest of my life. I called the court to order. I gave my usual opening statement. I told everyone that I was here to listen, to be fair, to understand their circumstances. I reminded them that I've made mistakes too, that I've gotten parking tickets, that I understand life gets complicated. I saw some people visibly relax when I said that. That's what I want. I want people to feel like they're being heard, not just processed. The first few cases went smoothly. A young woman who'd parked in a handicapped spot by accident. I could see the genuine remorse in her eyes. I reduced her fine and reminded her to be more careful. She thanked me with tears in her eyes. A college student who'd overstayed a meter while taking an exam. I dismissed it. Education matters more than parking enforcement. He couldn't believe it. The relief on his face made my morning. Then I called case number 7. I looked down at the file. Mr. Edward Sullivan, age 83, parking meter violation, downtown Providence, $10. Simple enough, I thought. I looked up to see who would approach the bench. That's when I saw him, and I'll never forget it as long as I live. An elderly man stood up slowly from the back row, very slowly. He was using a walker, one of those aluminum ones with tennis balls on the bottom legs. He was thin, so thin I could see the bones in his wrists. He wore a cardigan sweater that looked like it had been washed 1,000 times, faded blue, with one button missing. His pants were too big for him, held up with suspenders. His shoes were old but polished. Someone had taken care to make sure those shoes were clean. But it was his face that broke my heart. I've looked into thousands of faces from this bench. I can usually read people pretty well, but his face, it showed confusion. Not fear, not defiance, not nervousness, just pure, heartbreaking confusion, like he wasn't entirely sure where he was or why he was there. He started making his way to the front of the courtroom. It took forever. Each step was careful, deliberate. The walker made a soft scraping sound on the floor. I watched everyone in the gallery turn to look at him, some with pity, some with impatience, some with understanding. I held up my hand to signal that we would wait as long as it took. Nobody was going to rush this man, not in my courtroom. A woman suddenly stood up from the second row. She was in her 50s, I'd guess. She had the look of someone who was exhausted, the kind of exhaustion that comes from long-term caregiving. She hurried over to him and took his arm gently. She guided him forward, speaking softly to him. I could see her patience, her tenderness. I knew immediately this was his daughter. I've seen that look before, that combination of love and worry and weariness. They finally reached the bench. He looked up at me with watery blue eyes. Eyes that had probably been sharp once, that had seen a lifetime of joy and sorrow, that now held a fog I recognized. I've seen it before in my own relatives, in friends' parents, the fog of dementia, the cruel theft of memory that steals who we are piece by piece. I spoke gently. I said, "Good morning, Mr. Sullivan. I'm Judge Caprio. Do you know why you're here today?" He stared at me. He opened his mouth. He closed it. He looked at his daughter with an expression that tore my heart in half. It was the look of a child who doesn't know the answer and is afraid of disappointing his teacher. She squeezed his arm reassuringly. I waited. I've learned that silence is sometimes the most compassionate thing you can offer. Rushing people, especially people who are struggling, that's not justice. That's just cruelty with a gavel. His daughter spoke up. She said, "Your Honor, my name is Catherine Sullivan. This is my father, Edward. I'm here with him today because," and her voice cracked slightly, "because he has dementia. He was diagnosed 3 years ago. It's progressed significantly." I nodded. I said, "I understand. Please go on." And she took a breath. I could see she was trying to hold herself together. She said, "He got a parking ticket 6 weeks ago, downtown, on Westminster Street. He forgot to pay the meter, or maybe he paid it and forgot that it would expire. We're not entirely sure. He doesn't remember doing it. He doesn't remember getting the ticket. He doesn't remember much anymore, Your Honor." I looked at the file in front of me. March 15th, Westminster Street, 2-hour meter. He'd parked at 10 in the morning. The ticket was issued at 1:15, 3 hours and 15 minutes. The fine was $10, increased to $25 because it hadn't been paid within 2 weeks. Standard procedure. Nothing unusual about the violation itself, except everything was unusual about it because of who was standing in front of me. I looked at Mr. Sullivan. I said, "Mr. Sullivan, can you tell me what you were doing downtown that day?" He looked at me. He smiled slightly, a confused, sweet smile. He said, "I was getting bread. My wife likes the Italian bread from that bakery." He paused. Then he said, "Where is Margaret? Is she here?" Catherine closed her eyes. I saw a tear slide down her cheek. She said quietly, "Dad, Mom passed away 4 years ago. Remember?" He looked at her with such bewilderment. He said, "No, she's at home. She's making dinner. I need to get back for dinner." I had to look down at my desk for a moment. I've been doing this for 40 years, and I thought I had developed a thick skin. But there are some moments that cut right through whatever defenses you've built. This was one of them. I could feel the emotion rising in my throat. I cleared it. I looked back up. I said, "Catherine, tell me about your father. Tell me who he was before the dementia." She looked surprised by the question. People don't expect judges to ask about the person, about the life lived. But I have always believed that context matters, character matters. A lifetime of good should count for something. She wiped her eyes. She said, "My father was a teacher. He taught history at Hope High School for 37 years. He loved his students. He would stay after school for hours helping kids who were struggling. He coached the debate team. He volunteered at the Veterans Center. He served in Korea. He came home and dedicated his life to education and service." I watched her father as she spoke. He was looking around the courtroom now, seeming to notice it for the first time. He looked at the American flag. He looked at the seal of Rhode Island on the wall. He looked at me in my robes. None of it seemed to register as familiar or concerning. He was somewhere else in his mind. Catherine continued. She said, "He's been living with me for 2 years now, since it became clear he couldn't live alone anymore. I found him once trying to make breakfast at 3 in the morning. Another time he went for a walk and couldn't remember how to get home. A neighbor found him 6 blocks away, completely lost in his own neighborhood where he'd lived for 50 years. Her voice was shaking now. She said, "I try to watch him all the time, Your Honor. I really do. But I have 2 kids of my own, and I work part-time from home, and it's so hard. That day he got the ticket. I was on a work call. He must have taken my car keys when I wasn't looking. He drove downtown. He doesn't even have a license anymore. We'd taken it away, or I thought we had. I don't know how he found keys. He's clever sometimes, even with the dementia. He hides things. He forgets where he hides them. It's like living with a confused magician." I could see the guilt on her face, the crushing weight of caregiving and the impossible responsibility of trying to keep another human being safe 24 hours a day. I've watched my own sister go through this with our mother. I know what it does to families. The exhaustion, the heartbreak, the feeling that you're failing even though you're doing everything humanly possible. Now let me pause here for just a second. I need to ask you something. Have you ever watched someone you love disappear in front of your eyes? Not through death, but through the slow theft of memory and identity. Have you ever seen a family try to hold together while caring for someone with dementia? Leave me a comment because I actually read them. And if you're finding meaning in this story, if it's touching your heart like it touched mine, hit that like button for me. I looked at the parking ticket in front of me. $10 originally, $25 with the late fee. The law was clear. He'd violated the parking ordinance. He'd parked beyond the meter's time limit. The fine was standard, mandatory even. Any other judge would simply assess the fine, remind him to pay his meters. Next case. 5 minutes, done, move on. But I couldn't move on because I wasn't looking at a parking violation. I was looking at a man who'd served his country, who'd educated generations of young people, who'd been a good husband and father, who'd done everything right, and who was now at the mercy of a disease that was erasing him piece by piece. And I was looking at his daughter who was sacrificing her own life to care for him with love and dignity. I thought about my father. He died 15 years ago, his mind sharp until the very end, thank God. But I remember his last years. I remember how he needed help with things he'd done independently his whole life. I remember the adjustment, the humility required to accept that help, and he had his memory. He knew what was happening. Mr. Sullivan didn't even have that. He didn't know where he was. He thought his wife, who'd been gone for 4 years, was home making dinner. I made a decision right then. I said, "Mr. Sullivan, I'm going to ask you something. Did you serve in Korea?" He looked at me. Something flickered in his eyes, a brief clearing of the fog. He said, "Yes, sir. I was in the Army, 1951 to 1953. I was 19 when I enlisted." I said, "Thank you for your service, Mr. Sullivan. Truly." He nodded. He said, "We did what we had to do." Then the fog returned, and he looked confused again. I turned to Catherine. I said, "Does he have any other tickets, any other violations?" She shook her head quickly. She said, "No, Your Honor, nothing. He doesn't drive anymore." Well, he's not supposed to. That day it was a one-time thing. I've hidden all the keys now. I've put them in a lockbox. I've learned. It won't happen again. I believed her. I could see the determination in her eyes, the painful lessons learned, the adjustments made. She was doing her best in an impossible situation. I looked at the clerk. I looked at the assistant city solicitor who prosecutes these cases. He was a young guy, probably in his first year out of law school. He was watching the scene with wide eyes. I could tell he'd never seen anything like this before. I could tell he was uncomfortable, uncertain about what to do. I said to him, "Counsel, does the city have a position on this matter?" He stood up. He looked at his file. He looked at Mr. Sullivan. He looked back at me. He said, "Your Honor, the violation is documented. The fine is standard. But given the circumstances, the city would defer to the court's judgment." Good kid. He was learning that the law isn't just about rules and fines. It's about people. It's about context. It's about knowing when the spirit of justice requires mercy. I looked at Mr. Sullivan again. He was humming something softly now, a tune I didn't recognize. He seemed peaceful, unaware of the proceeding happening around him. His daughter held his arm, steadying him, loving him with every gesture. I picked up my gavel. I said, "Mr. Sullivan, I want you to listen to me carefully, if you can. You are a veteran. You are a teacher. You served your country, and you served your community for decades. You gave your life to helping others. That means something. That matters." I continued. I said, "You have an illness that is not your fault. You forgot to pay a parking meter because your memory is being taken from you by a disease you didn't choose and can't control. That is not a crime. That is a tragedy." I could see Catherine starting to cry. I could see people in the gallery leaning forward, listening intently. I said, "The law requires that parking violations be punished with fines. The law is clear about that, but the law also gives me discretion as a judge to consider circumstances, to weigh factors, to determine what justice actually requires in each individual case." I looked directly at Catherine. I said, "Your daughter is taking care of you with obvious love and dedication. She's doing one of the hardest jobs anyone can do. She's honoring you by keeping you safe and giving you dignity even as this disease tries to take it away." Then I made my decision. I said, "This ticket is dismissed. Case dismissed. No fine. No payment required. Mr. Sullivan, you go home with your daughter. You have nothing to owe." The courtroom erupted. People started clapping. I rarely hear applause in my courtroom, but I heard it then. Catherine was crying openly now, tears streaming down her face. She said, "Thank you, Your Honor. Thank you so much. You don't know what this means." But I did know. I knew exactly what it meant. It meant that somebody saw her struggle. Somebody recognized her father's humanity. Somebody acknowledged that mercy is not weakness, it's strength. It's what separates us from machines blindly applying rules. Mr. Sullivan looked at me. He smiled. He said, "You're a good man. Thank you." Then he paused and said, "Do you know when the bus comes? I need to get home." Catherine guided him gently toward the door. She turned back and mouthed, "Thank you one more time." I nodded. I watched them leave. His slow shuffle, her patient guidance, their shared journey through this cruel disease. I looked down at my desk. I took a breath. I felt good about that decision. I felt like I'd done what my father would have wanted me to do. I'd seen the human being, not just the violation. I'd remembered that justice without mercy is just cruelty with legal authority behind it. I was about to call the next case when I heard it. A voice from the back of the courtroom, loud, sharp, dripping with contempt. The voice said, "Oh, that's just great. So if you're old and confused, you get a free pass, but the rest of us have to pay. That's ridiculous." I looked up sharply. I scanned the gallery. I saw a woman in the third row. She was maybe 45, dressed in expensive clothes, designer sunglasses pushed up on her head, holding a phone in one hand and a large coffee cup in the other. She was looking at her friend next to her, talking loud enough for everyone to hear, clearly intending to be heard. I felt my jaw tighten. I said, "Excuse me, ma'am. This is a courtroom, not a coffee shop. Please keep your commentary to yourself." She looked at me. She actually rolled her eyes. She said, "I'm just saying what everyone's thinking. Some of us have jobs to get to, and we can't spend all day on sob stories." I could feel the temperature in the room change. I could see other people in the gallery looking at her with disgust. I could see Christina, my clerk, close her eyes and shake her head slightly. She knew I was not happy. I said, and I kept my voice level, "Ma'am, you will show respect in this courtroom, or you will be asked to leave. Am I clear?" She waved her hand dismissively. She went back to her phone, typing something, clearly not taking me seriously. I made a mental note. I looked at the docket. I found her name, Mrs. Pamela Henderson. She was case number 12, parking violation. Let's see how much respect she showed when it was her turn in front of me. I went through the next several cases. A young man who'd parked in a residential zone without a permit. Reduced fine, don't do it again. A woman who'd been caught by a speed camera going 38 in a 30 zone. Dismissed, those cameras are too aggressive. Another college student, another meter violation, reduced. I could see Mrs. Henderson checking her watch, sighing loudly, making it clear she thought this was all a waste of her valuable time. Look, I need to ask you for a favor. If this story's resonating with you, if you're getting something out of it, hit that subscribe button for me. It helps me share these lessons with more people who need to hear them. And tell me in the comments, have you ever dealt with someone who thought common courtesy didn't apply to them? I'm curious to hear your experiences. Finally, I called her case. I said, "Case number 12, Pamela Henderson, parking violation, downtown Providence." She stood up. She didn't hurry. She took her time, finished typing something on her phone, took a sip of her coffee, then sauntered toward the bench like she was doing me a favor by showing up. She wore heels that clicked loudly on the floor. She wore jewelry that probably cost more than most people in that courtroom made in a month. Everything about her screamed money and privilege, and the assumption that rules were for other people. She stopped in front of the bench. She didn't look at me. She was still looking at her phone. I said, "Mrs. Henderson, I'm going to need you to put that phone away and pay attention." She glanced up. She said, "Your Honor, I'm actually in the middle of an important text. Can you give me 1 second?" I could not believe what I was hearing. I said, "No, I cannot give you 1 second. Put the phone away now, or I'll hold you in contempt." She sighed dramatically. She put the phone in her purse. She looked at me like I was an annoying waiter who'd gotten her order wrong. I looked at her file. I said, "You're charged with parking in a handicapped space without proper identification. Downtown Providence, March 20th. Is that correct?" She said, "Yes, but I can explain." I said, "Please do." She said I was running into Nordstrom for just a minute. Literally 1 minute. I was picking up a handbag I'd ordered. The regular parking was full, and I was already late for lunch with a friend. So I parked in the handicapped spot. I was in and out in under 5 minutes. I stared at her. I said, "You parked in a handicapped space because you were running late for lunch?" She said, "Exactly. It's not like anyone needed it." There were other handicapped spots available, and like I said, it was 5 minutes maximum. I could feel my blood pressure rising. I said, "Mrs. Henderson, do you understand that handicapped parking spaces are reserved for people with mobility issues, people who actually need them?" She said, "Yes, obviously, but there were other spots. I wasn't hurting anyone." I said, "That's not how it works. Those spaces are protected by law for a reason. You don't get to decide whether someone needs them or not based on your lunch schedule." She actually laughed, a short, dismissive laugh. She said, "Your Honor, with all due respect, I think this is being blown out of proportion. It was 5 minutes. I'm happy to pay the fine and move on. I have a hair appointment at 2. I took a deep breath. I thought about Mr. Sullivan, who'd been standing in front of me less than an hour ago, confused and lost, guilty of nothing more than having a disease that stole his memory. And here was this woman, perfectly healthy, perfectly capable, who'd deliberately broken the law because she couldn't be bothered to walk an extra 50 feet from regular parking. I said, "The fine for parking in a handicapped space is $300. She didn't even blink. She said, "That's fine. Do you take credit cards?" That response told me everything I needed to know about her. $300 meant nothing to her. It wasn't a punishment. It wasn't a deterrent. It was just the price of convenience, like paying for valet parking. I said, "Mrs. Henderson, let me ask you something. Do you know anyone with a disability? Anyone who actually needs those parking spaces?" She looked annoyed by the question. She said, "I don't see what that has to do with anything." I said, "Answer the question, please." She said, "My aunt has MS. She uses a wheelchair sometimes." I said, "And how do you think your aunt would feel if she pulled into a parking lot needing a handicapped space, and they were all taken by people who just didn't feel like walking?" She said, "That's not the same thing. There were other spaces available that day." I said, "It's exactly the same thing. You took a space that wasn't yours to take because you decided your time was more valuable than someone else's need." She crossed her arms. She said, "Look, I said I'd pay the fine. Can we move this along?" I looked at her file more carefully. I saw something that caught my attention. I said, "Mrs. Henderson, I see here this is your third parking violation in 6 months. 2 previous tickets for parking in loading zones, both paid. Both times the fine was under $100. She shrugged. She said, "I'm busy. Sometimes I don't have time to find proper parking." I felt something shift inside me. I said, "You don't have time to follow the law?" She said, "That's not what I mean. I just mean that sometimes the convenience is worth the fine. I budget for it honestly. It's just part of living in the city." She budgets for breaking the law. She actually said that out loud in my courtroom. She treats parking tickets like a parking fee, like rules are optional if you can afford to pay your way around them. I said, "Mrs. Henderson, I want to make sure I understand you correctly. You're telling me that you knowingly break parking laws because paying the fine is more convenient than following the rules?" She realized maybe she'd said too much. She said, "I'm not saying I deliberately break laws. I'm just saying that sometimes mistakes happen and I pay for them." I said, "These aren't mistakes. A mistake is forgetting to pay a meter like Mr. Sullivan this morning. What you're describing is a choice, a calculated decision that laws don't apply to you if you can afford the fine." She said, "I think you're twisting my words, Your Honor." I said, "I don't think I am." There was silence in the courtroom. I could feel everyone watching this exchange. I could see people in the gallery who'd probably struggled to pay their own parking tickets, people for whom $300 was a significant hardship, watching this woman casually dismiss that amount like it was nothing. I'm going to be honest with you. At this point, I was struggling to keep my composure. This woman represented everything I fought against my entire career. The idea that wealth puts you above the law. The idea that money buys you the right to ignore rules that exist to protect vulnerable people. If you've ever felt that frustration watching someone disrespect something important, you know what I'm talking about. Hit that like button if you're still with me, and make sure you're subscribed, because what happens next I never saw coming in my entire career. I looked at Christina. She handed me another file. I hadn't asked for it, but she knows me well enough to anticipate what I need. I opened it. It was a report from the parking authority, a detailed breakdown of Mrs. Henderson's parking history. What I saw made my jaw drop. In the past 2 years, Pamela Henderson had received 23 parking tickets. 23. Most were for parking in illegal zones, loading zones, handicapped spaces, fire lanes. The fines totaled over $4,000. Every single one had been paid, usually within days. She hadn't contested a single ticket. She just paid them like they were parking meter fees. I looked up at her. I said, "Mrs. Henderson, did you know you received 23 parking tickets in 2 years?" She looked surprised that I knew that. She said, "I don't keep track of the exact number." I said, 23 tickets, $4,000 in fines, and you've never once appeared in court to contest them. You just pay them." She said, "Like I said, it's easier to just pay and move on." I said, "Easier for whom? Easier for you. But what about the person in a wheelchair who can't find parking because you took their space? What about the fire truck that can't get through because you parked in a fire lane? What about all the people who actually follow the rules and can't find legal parking because people like you treat illegal spaces as your personal parking spots?" She said, "Your Honor, I really don't appreciate the lecture. I've agreed to pay the fine. I don't understand what else you want from me. I said, I want you to understand that your actions have consequences. I want you to understand that the law applies to everyone equally, regardless of how much money you have. She said, and I heard the edge in her voice now, I do understand that, and I'm willing to pay the fine like everyone else. I said, but you're not like everyone else, are you, Mrs. Henderson? Everyone else can't afford to treat parking tickets like a convenience fee. Everyone else has to actually worry about $300 fines. For you, it's pocket change. She said, I don't think my financial situation is relevant here. I said, it's absolutely relevant, because the entire point of fines is to deter behavior. But if the fine doesn't deter you, if you can just absorb it without any real consequence, then the law isn't being applied equally. You're getting away with behavior that other people can't afford to get away with. I could see her getting angry now. Good. Maybe anger would break through the entitlement. She said, so what do you want me to do? Apologize? Fine. I'm sorry, I won't do it again. Can I pay now and leave? I looked at her. I knew she didn't mean it. I knew she'd do it again the moment it was convenient. I knew that as soon as she walked out of my courtroom, she'd go back to treating parking laws like suggestions. I thought about what to do. The law said I had to impose the fine, $300 mandatory for handicapped parking violations, but I had some discretion in other areas. I could require community service. I could require driving classes. I could suspend her license, though that seemed extreme for a parking violation. Then I noticed something else in her file, a note from the parking enforcement officer who'd written the ticket. I read it carefully. It said that when he'd approached her car, she'd been rude and dismissive. She'd told him she'd only be a minute and he should find something better to do with his time. She'd made a comment about city workers having nothing better to do than harass taxpayers. I said, Mrs. Henderson, when the parking officer approached you, what did you say to him? She looked uncomfortable. She said, I don't remember exactly. I might have been a bit short with him. I was in a hurry. I said, according to his report, you told him to find something better to do and made a comment about taxpayers. Is that accurate? She said, I was frustrated. I didn't mean anything by it. I said, you were frustrated? He was doing his job, a job you'd made necessary by parking illegally, and you were rude to him for it. She said, look, I've apologized. I've agreed to pay. What more do you want? What did I want? I wanted her to understand. I wanted her to feel some actual consequence for her actions. I wanted her to see that her behavior affected real people, that her convenience came at other people's expense, that the law mattered for everyone. That's when something unexpected happened. A man stood up in the gallery. He was in a wheelchair. He'd been sitting, or wheeling rather, in the back. I hadn't noticed him come in. He said, excuse me, Your Honor. May I say something? I was surprised, but I said, yes, please. Come forward. He wheeled himself up the aisle. It took some effort. The courtroom wasn't perfectly accessible, something I'd complained about for years. He finally made it to the front. He positioned himself next to Mrs. Henderson. She looked at him with an expression I couldn't quite read, somewhere between annoyance and discomfort. He said, Your Honor, my name is Marcus Williams. I'm here for a ticket later this morning, but I heard this conversation and I felt I had to speak up. I said, Go ahead, Mr. Williams. He turned to Mrs. Henderson. He said, Ma'am, I don't know you, but I need you to understand something. I was injured in Afghanistan in 2008. I lost the use of my legs. I've been in this wheelchair for 16 years now, and I can't tell you how many times I've driven to a store, to a doctor's appointment, to anywhere, and found all the handicapped spaces taken by people who don't have permits, people who are just too lazy to walk an extra 50 feet. Mrs. Henderson looked uncomfortable. She said, I'm sorry for your service and your injury, but I already explained there were other spaces available that day. Marcus said, You don't get it. Those spaces aren't first come, first serve. They're not there for you to use if others are available. They're there specifically for people like me who need them. Every single one matters because you never know when someone will need it. He continued. He said, Last month I had a doctor's appointment. I got to the medical building and all 4 handicapped spaces were full. 2 of the cars didn't have any permits at all. I had to circle for 20 minutes waiting for a space to open up. I was late for my appointment. They charged me a $50 missed appointment fee and wouldn't see me. I had to reschedule for 3 weeks later. 3 weeks living with pain I could have gotten treatment for because someone like you decided 5 minutes of convenience was worth more than my need. I watched Mrs. Henderson's face. I saw something flicker there, maybe shame, maybe just discomfort at being confronted directly. It was hard to tell. Marcus said, "I'm not trying to make you feel bad. I'm trying to make you understand. Those spaces exist because people like me need them, not want them, need them. When you take one, even for 5 minutes, you might be taking it from someone who literally cannot walk the distance from regular parking." Mrs. Henderson said quietly, "I didn't think about it like that." Marcus said, "That's the problem. People don't think. They just act out of convenience without considering who they might be hurting." I said, "Thank you, Mr. Williams. I appreciate you speaking up." He nodded. He wheeled himself back to his spot in the gallery. The courtroom was completely silent. Everyone had heard what he said. Everyone was watching to see what I would do next. Before I tell you what I decided, let me stop here and ask you something. Do you think wealth should protect someone from consequences? Should money let you treat laws like optional guidelines? Tell me what you think in the comments. And if you believe everyone should be equal under the law like I do, hit that subscribe button. Let me know I'm not alone in thinking this matters. I looked at Mrs. Henderson. I looked at the file in front of me. 23 tickets in 2 years, $4,000 in fines that hadn't changed her behavior one bit. A pattern of treating parking laws like they didn't apply to her. Rudeness to the officer doing his job. And now, confronted with the actual human cost of her actions, still no real understanding or remorse. I made my decision. I said, "Mrs. Henderson, I'm imposing the $300 fine for the handicapped parking violation. That's mandatory and non-negotiable." She nodded, clearly relieved this was almost over. I continued. I said, "But I'm also imposing additional requirements. You will complete 40 hours of community service at the Providence Veterans Center. You will spend those 40 hours assisting veterans with mobility issues. You will help people in and out of wheelchairs. You will see firsthand what it's like for people who need those handicapped spaces you've been using for convenience." Her mouth dropped open. She said, "Your Honor, I have a job. I have responsibilities. I can't just take time off to do community service." I said, "You found time to accumulate 23 parking tickets. You'll find time to do 40 hours of service. You have 6 months to complete it." She said, "This is ridiculous. No one gets community service for a parking ticket." I said, "You're not being punished for a parking ticket. You're being punished for a pattern of behavior that shows complete disregard for the law and for other people. You've demonstrated that fines don't deter you, so maybe service will teach you what money hasn't." She said, "I want to appeal this. This is excessive." I said, "That's your right, but the order stands until and unless it's overturned. Christina will give you the details about where to report for your community service." She was furious now. I could see it in her face. She said, "You're doing this because I can afford to pay the fines. You're punishing me for having money." I said, "I'm punishing you for thinking money puts you above the law. There's a difference." She grabbed her purse. She said, "This is unbelievable. I'll be speaking to my lawyer about this." I said, "You do that. But in the meantime, you have 40 hours of service to complete. If you fail to complete it, I'll issue a warrant for your arrest. Do you understand?" She glared at me. She said, "I understand that this is the worst experience I've ever had in a courtroom." I said, "Good. Maybe it'll be memorable enough that you'll actually change your behavior. Next case." She stormed out of the courtroom, her heels clicking angrily on the floor. I watched her go. I felt good about what I'd done. Not happy exactly, because I take no pleasure in punishing people, but satisfied that I'd made the right call. Sometimes the law requires more than a fine. Sometimes it requires actually confronting people with the consequences of their actions. The rest of the morning went by in a blur. I heard more cases, made more rulings, tried to balance justice and mercy in each one. But my mind kept going back to those 2 people. Mr. Sullivan, confused and sick, guilty of nothing more than having a disease that stole his memory. Mrs. Henderson, healthy and capable, guilty of deliberate, repeated disregard for laws that protected vulnerable people. The contrast couldn't have been starker. One person deserved compassion and got it. The other deserved accountability and got it. That's what justice means to me. It's not about treating everyone exactly the same. It's about treating everyone appropriately, based on their circumstances, their intent, their character. When court recessed for lunch, I went back to my chambers. I sat down at my desk. I was tired. These kinds of mornings take a lot out of you emotionally. Christina brought me a sandwich, turkey on wheat, same thing I have every day. She said, "That was quite a morning, Judge." I said, "That's an understatement." She said, "You know Mrs. Henderson is going to complain, probably to the press, maybe to the Judicial Oversight Board." I said, "Let her complain. I made the right call." She said, "I know you did. Everyone in that courtroom knew you did. Did you see the look on people's faces when you handed down that community service requirement? They were cheering inside." I smiled. I said, "I might have been cheering a little inside too." She left me alone with my sandwich and my thoughts. I thought about my father again. He would have approved of what I did. He believed that wealth came with responsibility, not privilege. He believed that respect was earned through character, not bought with money. He would have given Mr. Sullivan a hug and Mrs. Henderson a stern talking to, probably in Italian. Later that afternoon, after court was finished for the day, I was packing up my briefcase when Christina knocked on my door. She said, "Judge, there's someone here to see you. Says it's about this morning." I said, "If it's Mrs. Henderson's lawyer, tell them to file their appeal through proper channels." She said, "It's not her. It's Mr. Williams, the veteran in the wheelchair." I was surprised. I said, "Send him in." Marcus Williams wheeled into my chambers. I came around my desk and shook his hand. I said, "Mr. Williams, what can I do for you?" He said, "I just wanted to thank you, Your Honor, for what you did this morning, for making that woman understand that those parking spaces matter, for taking it seriously." I said I was just doing my job. He said, "No, you did more than that. Most judges would have just assessed the fine and moved on. You actually tried to make her understand. You actually gave her consequences that might change her behavior. That matters more than you know." I felt emotion rising in my throat again. I said, "Your words this morning, what you said to her about your experience, that's what made the difference. You gave a face to the issue. You made it real for her." He said, "I hope so. I hope she actually does that community service and actually learns something from it. But even if she doesn't, everyone else in that courtroom learned something. They learned that the law protects people like me. They learned that judges like you take it seriously. That means everything." We talked for a few more minutes. I learned that he was in college, studying computer science. He was working toward a degree while dealing with chronic pain and the challenges of navigating a world not always built for wheelchairs. He was, in short, exactly the kind of person those parking spaces were meant to serve, someone who'd sacrificed for his country and deserved every accommodation we could provide. After he left, I sat back down at my desk. I thought about the day. I thought about the morning I'd had, the contrast between Mr. Sullivan's vulnerability and Mrs. Henderson's entitlement. I thought about Marcus Williams, his dignity and strength despite everything he'd been through. This is exactly why I still put on these robes every morning after 40 years, for moments like these, when justice actually works the way it's supposed to, when mercy and accountability exist side by side, when the law protects the vulnerable and holds the privileged accountable. If that means something to you, if you believe in that, show me by hitting that like button and subscribing. Let me know I'm not alone in believing this stuff matters. 3 weeks later, I got a call from Christina. She said, "Judge, you need to hear this." I said, "What is it?" She said, "I just got a call from the director of the Providence Veterans Center about Mrs. Henderson." My heart sank. I thought, here we go. She's violated the community service order. She hasn't shown up. She's fighting it. I said, "What did she do?" Christina said she showed up, and apparently she's been showing up every week. She's already completed 20 hours of her 40-hour requirement, and according to the director, she's actually doing good work. She's helping veterans, listening to their stories, assisting with wheelchair transfers. The director said she seems genuinely changed by the experience. I was stunned. I said, "Really?" Christina said, "Really. The director wanted to let you know that whatever you did, however you reached her, it seems to have worked." I sat back in my chair. I allowed myself a moment of hope. Maybe she had learned something. Maybe confronting her with the reality of who her actions affected had actually broken through the entitlement. Maybe Marcus Williams' words had reached her in a way my lecture couldn't. Maybe justice had actually worked the way it was supposed to. I said, "Well, that's good news. Keep me updated on her progress." Christina said, "There's more. Mr. Sullivan's daughter called too, Catherine." I said, "Is everything okay?" She said, "Everything's fine. She just wanted to thank you again." She said that your kindness that day, the way you treated her father with dignity, it meant more to her family than you could know. She said it reminded her that there are still good people in the world who see beyond paperwork and rules to the human being underneath. I felt tears prick my eyes. I said, "That was kind of her to call." Christina said, she also said that her father passed away 2 weeks ago, peacefully, in his sleep. She wanted you to know that one of the last good days he had was the day in your courtroom, because he came home feeling respected and cared for, even though he didn't fully understand what had happened. I put my head in my hands. I let the tears come. 40 years on this bench, and I still cry over things like this. I'm not ashamed of that. If you stop feeling, you stop being able to judge fairly. You stop seeing the people in front of you. I said, "Thank you for telling me, Christina." She said gently, "You did good that day, Judge. You did real good." After she left, I sat alone in my chambers for a long time. I thought about Edward Sullivan, a man who'd served his country and educated generations and loved his wife and raised his children and ended his life confused and lost to a disease that shows no mercy. I thought about his daughter, Catherine, loving him through that confusion, caring for him with patience and grace. I thought about the dignity I'd tried to give him that day in my courtroom, something small, but something real. And I thought about Pamela Henderson, who'd walked into my courtroom thinking money could solve everything, and who maybe, just maybe, was learning that some lessons can't be bought, that some values can't be purchased, that respect and character and understanding are earned through actions, not bank accounts. 4 months later, I was in my chambers going through some files when Christina knocked again. She had a letter in her hand. She said, "This came for you, from Mrs. Henderson." I took it. I opened it. I read it carefully. I'm going to share with you what it said because I think it matters. She wrote, "Dear Judge Caprio, I'm writing to let you know that I completed my 40 hours of community service at the Veterans Center last week. I want to thank you, though I didn't feel that way at the time. When you sentenced me to community service, I was angry. I thought you were being unfair, singling me out, punishing me excessively. I was ready to appeal, to fight, to prove you were wrong. But my lawyer talked me out of it. He said I should just do the 40 hours and move on. So I did, or I started to. But something happened that I didn't expect. I met the veterans. I heard their stories. I helped a man named James get from his wheelchair to a chair at a table, and he thanked me with tears in his eyes for such a simple thing. I listened to a woman named Sarah talk about how she struggles every day with pain from an injury she got serving our country, and how handicapped parking spaces are sometimes the difference between her being able to go somewhere or staying home isolated. I met Marcus Williams, the man from your courtroom that day. He's been volunteering at the center for years. He told me about his struggles, about the times he couldn't access buildings or parking because people like me made it impossible. Judge Caprio, I was one of those people. I was thoughtless and entitled, and I didn't care about anyone but myself. Your fine wouldn't have changed that. I would have paid it and gone right back to my old behavior. But the community service, being forced to actually meet the people affected by my actions, that changed me. I can't take back the times I parked illegally. I can't undo the inconvenience and pain I might have caused others. But I can tell you that I will never park in a handicapped space again, ever. And I've started volunteering at the center beyond my required hours. I go every Saturday now. I'm learning that service to others, actually seeing and helping people, is more valuable than any lunch appointment or shopping trip. Thank you for seeing that I needed more than a fine. Thank you for giving me a punishment that actually taught me something. I'm a better person because of it. Respectfully, Pamela Henderson. I set the letter down. I had to take my glasses off and wipe my eyes. You know, people ask me sometimes why I still do this job at my age, why I don't retire and spend my days playing golf or traveling or just relaxing. This is why. This letter is why. Because every once in a while, justice doesn't just punish, it transforms, it teaches, it makes someone better than they were. That doesn't always happen. Most of the time, people pay their fines and leave, and I never know if anything changed. But sometimes, if you're lucky, if you make the right call, you can actually reach someone. You can plant a seed that grows into understanding, into empathy, into real change. After she left, I sat alone in my chambers for a long time. I thought about Edward Sullivan, a man who'd served his country and educated generations and loved his wife and raised his children and ended his life confused and lost to a disease that shows no mercy. I thought about his daughter, Catherine, loving him through that confusion, caring for him with patience and grace. I thought about the dignity I'd tried to give him that day in my courtroom, something small, but something real. And I thought about Pamela Henderson, who'd walked into my courtroom thinking money could solve everything, and who maybe, just maybe, was learning that some lessons can't be bought, that some values can't be purchased, that respect and character and understanding are earned through actions, not bank accounts. I called the Veterans Center that afternoon. I spoke to the director. I asked about Mrs. Henderson. He confirmed everything she'd written. He said she was one of their most dedicated volunteers now, that the veterans loved her, that she'd made a real difference in the lives of several people who'd come to count on her help. He said something else, too. He said, "Judge, whatever you did, however you reached her, you should know that you didn't just change her. You changed all the people she's now helping." That's the ripple effect of good judgment. One decision, one sentence, rippling out to touch dozens of lives in positive ways. I thought about that for a long time, the ripple effect. Mr. Sullivan got compassion when he needed it, and his daughter felt seen and supported in her impossible task of caregiving. That was a ripple. Mrs. Henderson got accountability when she needed it, and she became someone who now serves others. That was a ripple. Marcus Williams spoke up for himself and others like him, and his words reached both me and Mrs. Henderson. That was a ripple. That's what I've learned in 40 years on this bench. Justice isn't just about the moment in the courtroom. It's about the ripples that extend from that moment out into people's lives, into their families, into their communities. Every decision I make, every sentence I hand down, every bit of mercy I show or accountability I demand, it ripples outward in ways I'll never fully know. 2 years have passed since that Tuesday morning when Mr. Sullivan shuffled into my courtroom. I still think about him often. I still think about his confusion, his vulnerability, his daughter's love. I still think about how close I came to just assessing a fine and moving on, not understanding the full context of what was happening. I'm glad I took the time to ask questions. I'm glad I saw beyond the violation to the person. I'm glad I remembered that mercy is not weakness, it's wisdom. It's understanding that life is complicated, that circumstances matter, that a good person can make a mistake or be victimized by something beyond their control and still deserve dignity and compassion. I think about Mrs. Henderson, too. I think about how she walked into my courtroom entitled and dismissive, and how she walked out angry and resentful, but how that anger eventually transformed into understanding. I'm glad I gave her community service instead of just a fine. I'm glad I forced her to confront the reality of who her actions affected. I'm glad she was open enough to learn from it, but mostly I think about what both cases taught me, that justice is not one size fits all, that the law gives us a framework, but wisdom requires us to apply that framework with understanding, with context, with recognition that we're dealing with human beings, not just case files. My father taught me that everyone deserves respect, from the street sweeper to the building owner. My 40 years on this bench have taught me that everyone also deserves to be seen, truly seen, as an individual with their own story, their own struggles, their own capacity for both mistakes and growth. So let me ask you this. Do you think I was too harsh on Mrs. Henderson, or not harsh enough? I'm genuinely curious what you think, because justice isn't just what happens in a courtroom. It's what we all decide as a society is fair, is right, is appropriate. And here's another question for you. If you were in my position, what would you have done? Would you have shown Mr. Sullivan the same mercy? Would you have given Mrs. Henderson the same accountability? Would you have handled either situation differently? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. I actually read them, every single one. It helps me understand what matters to people, what resonates, what lessons are worth sharing. If this story meant something to you, if you believe in equal justice like I do me a favor. Hit that like button and subscribe to this channel. Turn on that bell icon so you never miss another story from my courtroom. Because I've got 40 years of stories, and each one has taught me something about justice, about mercy, about what it means to be human. Share this video with someone who needs to hear this message, someone who believes that character matters more than cash, someone who's struggling with a sick parent and needs to know that compassion still exists, someone who's feeling entitled and needs a reminder that we're all equal before the law. And check out the next video on your screen. I've got another incredible story from my courtroom that you won't believe. A case that taught me about the power of second chances, about redemption, about how people can surprise you if you give them the opportunity. I'll see you tomorrow with another lesson about justice, respect, and what really matters in this life. Another story from 4 decades on this bench. 4 decades of watching humanity at its worst and its best. 4 decades of trying to balance the scales of justice with the weight of mercy. I'm Frank Caprio. I've been on this bench for 40 years because I believe something simple. We're all equal before the law, every single one of us. Rich or poor, powerful or powerless, sick or healthy, young or old. That's what makes this country work. That's what makes justice possible. The understanding that we all stand on the same ground when we enter a courtroom, that we're all entitled to the same dignity, the same consideration, the same fair treatment. Thank you for listening to my story. Thank you for caring about these issues. Thank you for being part of a community that believes in real justice, not just punishment, but transformation. Justice that sees people, that understands context, that balances accountability with compassion. God bless you, and remember, respect costs nothing, but it's worth everything. And so does compassion, so does understanding, so does taking the time to really see the person standing in front of you, to hear their story, to recognize their humanity. That's what I try to do every day. That's what I've tried to do for 40 years. That's what I'll keep doing as long as I'm able to climb up to this bench and put on these robes. Because every person who walks into my courtroom deserves to be seen, to be heard, to be treated with dignity. Whether they're an elderly man with dementia who forgot to pay a parking meter, or a wealthy woman who thought money put her above the law, or a veteran in a wheelchair who just wants the world to be a little more accessible, or any of the thousands of people I've had the privilege of serving over 4 decades. Each one has taught me something. Each one has added to my understanding of what justice really means. And I'm grateful for every single one of them, even the difficult cases, even the frustrating ones, even the ones that made me angry or sad or brought me to tears, because they've all made me a better judge and hopefully a better human being. Thank you for being here. Thank you for listening. I'll see you in the next one.